Welcome to this short presentation of transaction verification criteria, which is a proposed change in the draft chain of custody standard. In the FSC chain of custody system, certificate holders are required to make an FSC claim when selling a product as FSC certified. FSC claims are made on invoices to customers. However, some certificate holders may make false FSC claims on invoices. This can happen intentionally or unintentionally. Under the current chain of custody rules and requirements, it is very difficult for certification bodies to identify such a problem. In a survey completed in 2015, 97% of our stakeholders agreed that FSC needs to address this risk of false claims. Therefore, FSC is proposing new criteria to address the risk of false claims. This criteria is called transaction verification. Transaction verification is a mechanism that enables certification bodies, or CBs, to confirm that FSC input and output claims made by certificate holders are correct and match the declared FSC inputs and outputs by their trading partners. FSC has developed the Online Claims Platform, or OCP for short, as a method to enable transaction verification. The OCP provides a secure platform for certificate holders to provide their transaction data for verification by their certification bodies. According to the draft criteria, not all certificate holders will be required to use the OCP. In contrast to the previous consultations, this new criteria proposes a risk-based approach to the implementation of transaction verification. Only certificate holders that have a high risk of false claims will be required to use the OCP. Certificate holders with a low risk of false claims will not be required to use the OCP. And while it is not required, the use of the OCP is recommended as a risk mitigation tool. Using the OCP will enable certification bodies to verify transactions between FSC trading partners, and therefore will reduce the risk of false claims in a certificate holder's supply chain. In order to determine the risk of false claims, or RFC for short, FSC has developed the proposed risk matrix as seen here, which is part of the Chain of Custody Accreditation Standard and included in this public consultation. Certification bodies will assess their certificate holders' risk of false claims using this risk matrix. Risk can be based on the organization as a whole or for specific sites and/or product groups. There are 4 categories in the RFC matrix. The first category is for material type. Here, a risk score is based on the type of material traded, such as hardwood, softwood, tropical timber, or CITES species. The next category is for the Corruption Perception Index, or CPI. Here, a risk score is given based on the country where the company's site is located. CPI for each country can be found by visiting Transparency International's website. The next category looks at how the organization has performed in relation to its chain of custody conformity. For example, this category will consider corrective action requests in regard to false claims, and whether the organization has changed certification bodies more than twice in a 5-year certification period. There are also 2 mitigation points where a certificate holder can lower their RFC score. And the last category is based on the evidence of false claims that has occurred in a certificate holder's supply chain, or evidence of false claims systematically occurring in the country where the organization or its site is located. Please note that the RFC score is defined for the organization and not for its suppliers and customers. All activities under the scope of an FSC certificate will be subject to this risk assessment. However, an organization may choose to have its risk of false claims score applied to specific sites and/or product groups. For example, an organization that has one product group that is defined as high risk may have other product groups that are classified as low risk. The organization is only required to use the OCP for the transactions related to high-risk product groups. Regardless of RFC score, all certificate holders may use the OCP as a risk mitigation tool. Section 3, as seen here, is a proposed change in the Chain of Custody Accreditation Standard and is also part of this public consultation. This section describes how through using the OCP as a risk mitigation tool, along with other criteria, can potentially reduce the number of on-site audits by the certification body. Please note, this is in addition to the current rule, which allows certificate holders to waive an audit when they have not made any FSC claims or labeled any products as FSC certified. As you've learned through this presentation, the proposal for transaction verification would require all certificate holders evaluated as high risk to use the OCP. Testing and previous stakeholder consultation has shown that it is not feasible to allow multiple systems for transaction verification. Using multiple systems would create too great a burden for certificate holders and certification bodies. Multiple systems would lead to records of input and output transactions being stored in many different places and would make the job of an auditor difficult and costly. Multiple systems also introduces risk to data security and may still result in false claims. So, while it is being proposed that the OCP is the only way for certificate holders to comply with transaction verification requirements, FSC does recognize alternative systems as a risk mitigation factor. Therefore, an organization's RFC score is reduced by 1 point if an alternative transaction verification system is in place. This means that if an organization classifies as high risk but uses an externally controlled traceability system or is subject to third-party supply chain audits, they would have the opportunity to move from high risk to low risk. With this proposed transaction verification criteria and risk matrix, FSC strives to make the FSC system stronger while keeping things as simple as possible through a risk-based approach. FSC welcomes your comments on this final consultation of the Chain of Custody standard. And thank you for your participation.